Hello there, and welcome to Deep Sleep Seas. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you've had a long day, maybe your mind has been racing, or maybe you're simply the kind of person who finds peace in learning about the hidden corners of our world. Whatever brought you here, you've come to the right place. Tonight we're going on a journey to somewhere almost no human has ever been. A place so remote, so dark, so crushingly deep that it exists beyond the reach of sunlight, beyond the limits of most life, beyond what we thought possible. We're descending to the Hadal zone, the deepest parts of the ocean, where the seafloor plunges into trenches that cut through the Earth's crust like ancient scars. These are places named after the Greek underworld, realms that remained mysterious until just over a century ago, and even now, in our age of satellites and supercomputers, they remain among the least explored environments on our planet. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and your thoughts drift like sediment settling through dark water. You have nothing to do but rest. Because tonight we're sinking past the sunlit shallows, past the midnight zone, past even the abyssal plains, down to where the ocean finally ends, down to Hadal depths, down to where pressure becomes a physical presence, where every square inch of surface bears the weight of 1,000 atmospheres, where darkness is not just the absence of light, but a fundamental condition of existence. Creatures we're only beginning to understand have found ways to thrive in what should be uninhabitable. Snailfish with transparent skin and bodies made mostly of water, and yet, even here, life persists. Amphipods the size of dinner plates. Before we begin our descent, if you find these deep ocean stories relaxing, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into the blue. Microorganisms that might hold secrets to the origins of life itself. Now close your eyes. Feel yourself becoming weightless. And if you're still awake, let me know where in the world you're listening from. The surface is far above, down to where the ocean finally ends. And we're going down. The Hadal zone begins where the abyssal plains give way to something deeper. Here, along the boundaries where Earth's tectonic plates meet and collide, the ocean floor drops away into narrow, steep-walled trenches that plunge even deeper into the planet. At around 6,000 meters below the surface, 20,000 feet down, the seafloor stops being a vast, flat expanse and starts to break open. It's a fitting name for a place that exists in perpetual night, where the weight of the ocean above creates pressures that would crush most living things instantly, where temperatures hover just above freezing year-round. The Hadal zone extends from 6,000 meters down to the deepest known point on Earth, nearly 11,000 meters below the waves. That's almost 7 miles straight down. These are the Hadal depths, named after Hades, the Greek god of the underworld. If you placed Mount Everest at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest of these trenches, its peak would still be more than a mile beneath the surface. These trenches are scattered across the ocean floor, mostly ringing the Pacific Ocean along what's known as the Ring of Fire. There are 37 known Hadal trenches worldwide, though new ones are still being discovered. Together they make up less than 0.25% of the world's seafloor, yet they account for the deepest 45% of the ocean's total depth range. The Mariana Trench alone extends for over 1,500 miles across the western Pacific. They are long, narrow, V-shaped gashes in the Earth's crust, most of them no more than a few dozen miles wide, but stretching for hundreds or even thousands of miles in length, where organisms have evolved in isolation from the rest of the ocean, adapting to conditions so extreme that scientists once believed nothing could survive there at all. But life, as always, found a way. Despite their small surface area, these trenches represent one of the largest and least explored habitats on our planet, a place where the familiar rules of life at the surface no longer apply. The story of the Hadal zone begins not in darkness, but aboard a wooden sailing ship cutting through sunlit seas. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we'll explore these hidden depths together, slowly, gently, sinking through layers of darkness until we reach the very bottom of the world. On March 23, 1875, HMS Challenger, a British Royal Navy corvette that had been converted into the world's first dedicated oceanographic research vessel, was sailing southwest of the Mariana Islands in the western Pacific. That day, the crew lowered a weighted hemp rope into the water to measure the depth, as they had done hundreds of times before at stations all across the Atlantic and Pacific. They lowered the line. The ship had left Portsmouth, England, more than 2 years earlier on a mission to explore the world's oceans, to take measurements, to collect samples, to discover what lay beneath the waves in places no one had yet bothered to look. The rope fell through the water, meter after meter, fathom after fathom, far deeper than any measurement they had taken before. The crew must have watched with growing astonishment as the line continued to unspool. 4,000 meters, and they kept lowering. 6,000, 5,000. Still it fell. The Challenger had discovered what would later be recognized as the Mariana Trench, the deepest known depression in the entire ocean. But that first measurement was just the beginning. The technology of the 1870s was crude. The hemp rope stretched under its own weight. Finally, after feeding out more than 8,000 meters of rope, nearly 5 miles, the weight touched bottom. Currents pushed it sideways. The measurements were approximate at best. Still, the discovery was momentous. It suggested that the seafloor was not a flat, featureless plain, but a landscape of mountains and valleys, ridges and trenches, as varied as any continental terrain. It proved that the ocean had depths beyond what anyone had imagined. The Challenger expedition would continue for another year, circumnavigating the globe, discovering thousands of new species, proving that life existed even in the deepest parts of the ocean, establishing the foundations of modern oceanography. Instead of a weighted rope, it used an echo sounder, a device that measured depth by timing how long it took for sound waves to travel to the seafloor and back. 76 years later, in 1951, another British ship returned to the same area. HMS Challenger II, named in honor of its predecessor, carried more advanced technology. Among its many discoveries, none would capture the imagination quite like that deep sounding in the Western Pacific. The deepest point they measured, at the very bottom of the trench, was later named Challenger Deep in honor of both ships and the men who sailed them. In October of that year, Challenger II ran survey lines back and forth across the southern Mariana Trench. The echo sounder recorded depths that exceeded 10,800 meters, nearly 36,000 feet. Even with better technology, the measurement was still indirect. No one had seen what lay at the bottom. No one had actually been there. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh climbed into a small steel sphere attached to the bottom of a strange vessel called a bathyscaphe, essentially an underwater dirigible filled with gasoline for buoyancy. On that day, Swiss oceanographer Jacques Piccard and U.S. No human eye had gazed upon the deepest point on Earth. That would change 9 years later, on January 23, 1960. The vessel was named Trieste, and it had been designed by Piccard's father specifically to reach the deepest parts of the ocean. The descent took nearly 5 hours. Through the twilight zone, where the last traces of sunlight fade to blue, then violet, then black, Piccard and Walsh sat cramped in their sphere, barely 6 feet in diameter, as the Trieste sank through layer after layer of ocean, through the abyssal plains, the vast flatlands of the deep ocean floor, and finally down into the trench itself, the walls rising on either side as they descended into the planetary scar. At one point, as they approached the deepest section, they heard a loud crack. The plexiglass window in their viewport had fractured under the pressure. Through the midnight zone, where bioluminescent creatures drift like living stars. For a moment, they considered aborting, but the sphere held, and they continued down. At 35,800 feet, 10,900 meters, the Trieste touched the bottom of Challenger Deep. They spent 20 minutes there, peering out through their small window. Piccard and Walsh became the first human beings to reach the deepest known point on Earth. Piccard reported seeing what he thought was a flatfish, a small flat creature resting on the seafloor. Vertebrates shouldn't be able to survive. Many scientists later doubted this sighting, suggesting he might have seen a sea cucumber or some other invertebrate. At such extreme pressure, they argued, bones should dissolve. There was life at the bottom. The Hadal zone was not a sterile, lifeless wasteland. Something lived there. But whether or not Piccard saw a fish, the dive proved something crucial. Something had adapted to conditions that would kill almost any other organism on the planet. After their historic dive, Piccard and Walsh returned to the surface. By the mid-1970s, the bathyscaphe had been retired. No manned vehicle capable of reaching such depths existed anymore. The Trieste would dive again, but never that deep. And so for 52 years, no human returned to Challenger Deep. The deepest point on Earth was visited once, for 20 minutes, and then abandoned. James Cameron, the filmmaker who had directed Titanic and Avatar, piloted a custom-built submersible called Deep Sea Challenger to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It wasn't until March 26, 2012, that someone finally went back. The sub was equipped with powerful lights and 3D cameras, allowing Cameron to capture the first high-definition footage of the deepest ocean. Unlike the Trieste, which looked like an underwater blimp, the Deep-Sea Challenger was a vertical torpedo, a narrow tube designed to slice through the water. He spent several hours at the bottom, far longer than Pickard and Walsh had managed, collecting samples and documenting the barren landscape. The footage he brought back showed a world of fine sediment and strange, ghostly creatures. Small amphipods swarmed around the lights. Sea cucumbers lay scattered across the bottom, like pale fingers. The seafloor itself was surprisingly barren, but not lifeless. After Cameron's dive, interest in Hadal exploration was rekindled. Between 2019 and 2022, there were 20 more manned descents to Challenger Deep. American investor Victor Vescovo visited the site 15 times, more than anyone in history, using a submersible called the Limiting Factor. Kelly Walsh, son of Don Walsh, made the journey, completing a circle that spanned nearly 60 years. Astronaut Catherine Sullivan descended, becoming the first woman to reach the deepest point on Earth. Others followed. The Hadal Zone, for so long a place visited only in imagination, was finally being explored. But even now, with all our technology, all our submersibles and ROVs and autonomous landers, we have barely scratched the surface of these deep places. Most of the 37 Hadal trenches have never been visited by humans. Many have never been mapped in detail. A vast, dark, pressure-crushed world that covers an area half the size of Australia, lying in scattered trenches around the globe, most of them in the Pacific, a few in the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Some have never even been thoroughly surveyed. The Hadal Zone remains one of the least known environments on our planet. Life that evolved in isolation, life that found solutions to problems that seem impossible, life that reminds us how little we truly understand about the limits of existence on this blue planet. And in that darkness, beneath that pressure, life continues. To understand why the Hadal Zone exists at all, we need to look at the very bones of the Earth, at the massive tectonic plates that make up our planet's outer shell, the lithosphere, constantly moving, constantly grinding against each other in a slow-motion dance that has been going on for billions of years. The Earth's crust is not a single solid shell. It's broken into roughly a dozen major plates and many smaller ones, all floating atop the hot, semi-molten rock of the mantle below. Continents drift, oceans widen. These plates move, typically just a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow. But over millions of years, these tiny movements add up, and in some places where plates collide, the crust itself bends and breaks, creating the deepest depressions on the planet. Mountains rise. Hadal trenches form at subduction zones, places where one tectonic plate slides beneath another. Imagine two vast sheets of rock meeting along a line. As it descends into the mantle, it pulls the edge of the overlying plate down with it, creating a deep, narrow depression. A trench, one plate, usually oceanic crust, which is denser and heavier, begins to sink beneath the other. This process, called subduction, is responsible for creating some of Earth's most dramatic geological features. And at the boundary between them, where one plate bends and begins its journey down into the mantle, the seafloor drops away into the Hadal depths. Volcanic island arcs form above subduction zones as the descending plate melts and magma rises to the surface. Earthquakes are common, generated by the grinding friction between the two plates. The Mariana Trench, the deepest of all, was formed this way. Here, the Pacific Plate, a vast expanse of oceanic crust, is sliding beneath the smaller Mariana Plate. It takes roughly 200 million years for a section of oceanic crust to make the journey from its birth at a mid-ocean ridge to its death at a subduction zone like this. The Pacific Plate is old, cold, and dense. As it bends downward into the mantle, it creates a depression that plunges more than 10,900 meters below sea level. The trench is narrow, only about 43 miles wide on average, but it stretches for over 1,500 miles in a gentle arc across the western Pacific. If you could stand at the edge of the Mariana Trench and look down, you would see walls that drop away at steep angles 30 to 45 degrees in places, descending into absolute blackness. Far from it. The Pacific Ocean is ringed with them, a consequence of the ring of fire, that circle of subduction zones and volcanoes that marks the Pacific's boundaries. The deepest point, Challenger Deep, is at the southern end, though the entire trench exceeds depths of 6,000 meters along most of its length. The Mariana is not the only Hadal trench. All of them were carved by subduction, by the slow, inexorable descent of oceanic crust into the mantle. Other oceans have trenches too. The Puerto Rico Trench in the Atlantic reaches depths of over 8,400 meters. The South Sandwich Trench in the Southern Ocean exceeds 7,300 meters. The Tonga Trench, the Kermadec Trench, the Japan Trench, the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench, the Philippine Trench, all of these exceed 10,000 meters in their deepest sections. Each one is a narrow gash in the seafloor, a place where the planet's outer shell is breaking and bending, where geology creates an environment unlike anywhere else on Earth. These trenches are ancient, though not in human terms. The Java Trench in the Indian Ocean plunges past 7,200 meters. The Mariana Trench, for instance, is estimated to have begun forming around 25 million years ago, when the Pacific Plate began subducting beneath the Mariana Plate. The deepest section, Challenger Deep, may be closer to 8 to 10 million years old. That might seem like an eternity, but in geological time it's relatively recent. The dinosaurs had been extinct for tens of millions of years when the Mariana Trench started to form. Early humans would not appear for another 24 million years. And yet in that geologically brief span, the trench has become the defining feature of the Hadal Zone, a place carved by forces operating on scales we can barely comprehend. The plates are still moving, forces that continue today. The Pacific Plate is still descending. The trenches are still there, still deepening, still creating environments where pressure and darkness and cold combine to form one of the most extreme habitats on the planet. A place where the ocean, vast as it is, finally runs out of room to fall. Where the Earth's crust is being actively destroyed, recycled back into the mantle, completing a cycle that has shaped our planet for billions of years. And in those trenches, in that crushing darkness, we find something unexpected. We find life, where water presses down with a force that would flatten any unprepared organism instantly. Fish dart past. Imagine descending through the ocean. At the surface, the water is warm, at least in tropical regions, and flooded with sunlight. You can see clearly for dozens of feet in any direction. Everything feels open, alive, possible. Keep descending. The water shimmers. By 200 meters, 600 feet down, the light is fading. The blues are deepening. This is the twilight zone, where only the faintest traces of sunlight penetrate. The water is colder. Many creatures here have large eyes to capture what little light remains. No sunlight reaches here. Some produce their own light through bioluminescence, glowing in the darkness. At 1,000 meters, 3,300 feet, you cross into the midnight zone. The temperature has dropped to just a few degrees above freezing. The pressure is 100 times what it is at the surface, enough to crush a human body instantly without protection. The darkness is absolute, but there is still life here. Strange fish with huge jaws and bioluminescent lures, giant squid drifting through the black, jellyfish pulsing softly. This is the deep ocean, but it's not the deepest. At 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet, you reach the abyssal plains. These are vast, flat expanses of seafloor that cover much of the deep ocean. Keep descending. Here the pressure is 400 times atmospheric pressure. Nothing living produces light anymore. The darkness is total. The cold is numbing. The seafloor is covered in fine sediment, the accumulated fallout of billions of tiny organisms that lived and died in the waters above and slowly drifted down. Sea cucumbers creep across the bottom. But we're still not at the bottom. Brittle stars wave their arms in the faint currents. This is the abyssal zone, and it covers more than half of Earth's surface. Not quite. You've reached the edge of a trench. At 6,000 meters, 20,000 feet, the character of the seafloor changes. The flat abyssal plains give way to steep slopes. 700. As you descend further, the walls rise on either side. The pressure continues to increase. 600 atmospheres. 800. At 8,000 meters, the pressure reaches 800 times what it is at the surface, roughly 16,000 pounds per square inch. Imagine an African elephant balanced on your thumbnail. That's the pressure at this depth. The walls of the trench tower above you now, slopes of rock and sediment vanishing into the darkness. At 10,000 meters, 33,000 feet, you're deeper than commercial aircraft fly. The pressure is 1,000 atmospheres. And still, you continue down. And finally, at 10,900 meters, 35,800 feet, you touch bottom. This is Challenger Deep, the deepest known point on Earth, 11 million pounds per square foot, the Hadal zone. The pressure would collapse our lungs, crush our bones, rupture every cell in our bodies. The environment here is almost incomprehensible to surface-dwelling organisms like us, not a photon. The temperature is just above freezing, hovering around 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. Cold enough that without constant circulation, the deep water would freeze solid. There is no light, not a glimmer. No photosynthesis is possible. No plant can grow here. The only food comes from above, from the long, slow rain of organic material that drifts down from the sunlit surface, a distance of 7 miles. Marine snow, they call it. Tiny particles of dead plankton, fecal matter, bits of larger organisms that died in the waters above. And yet, despite these conditions, despite the crushing pressure and the freezing temperatures and the absolute darkness and the scarcity of food, despite all of it, the Hadal zone is not empty. It falls like snow, accumulating over time on the seafloor, providing the only source of nutrients for the creatures that live here. Life has found its way here. Life has adapted. Life thrives in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Hadal zone is isolated, not just vertically but horizontally. The Hadal zone is, in effect, a series of island ecosystems, deep islands in an ocean of slightly less deep water, each developing its own unique community of organisms. Scientists have found that there is a distinct shift in the types of life that exist as you cross the boundary from the abyssal zone into the Hadal zone, somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 meters. Each trench is a separate world, cut off from the others by thousands of miles of abyssal plains. Species that evolve in one trench may be completely different from those in another. The pressure becomes too great for many organisms. The isolation becomes too extreme. But for those that can adapt, the Hadal zone offers something valuable. A refuge, a place where competition is reduced, where predators from shallower waters can't follow, where the very extremity of the environment becomes a kind of protection. This is the world we're exploring tonight. A world that should be lifeless but isn't. A world of darkness and pressure and cold. A world where some of the strangest creatures on Earth have made their home. At the bottom, as you drift towards sleep, picture yourself there. In the dark, in the cold, in the quiet. The weight of the ocean above, 7 miles of water, pressing down. But you are safe, suspended in this moment, in this darkness, in this place where the ocean finally ends. In the year 2014, scientists exploring the Mariana Trench using a baited lander, a free-falling instrument package designed to sink to the seafloor, take pictures, and then jettison weights and float back to the surface, captured something extraordinary on camera. The pressure all around you, but holding you gently, like water holds everything. It was pink, almost transparent, with a soft, gelatinous body that seemed to ripple with every movement. Its fins were delicate, almost ethereal. It had no scales. At a depth of over 8,000 meters, 26,000 feet below the surface, they filmed a small ghostly fish swimming near the bait, and it was alive at a depth where, according to what scientists thought they knew about fish physiology, no fish should be able to survive. This was a Hadal snailfish, and its discovery would change our understanding of what vertebrates can endure. Its eyes were tiny, barely visible. Snailfish belong to the family Leporidae, a diverse group of fish found throughout the world's oceans. Most snailfish live in relatively shallow water, along coastlines and in polar regions. But some members of this family have colonized the deep sea, and a handful have pushed deeper still, into the Hadal trenches. The Hadal snailfish is the deepest living vertebrate known to science. They're small, unremarkable fish with tadpole-shaped bodies and soft, scaleless skin. When scientists examined these fish, they found an organism exquisitely adapted to the Hadal environment. The fish filmed in the Mariana Trench in 2014 was later identified as a new species, Pseudoleparis swire, named after Herbert Swire, a navigating officer on the original HMS Challenger expedition. Subsequent expeditions managed to capture several specimens using fish traps. The largest was about 27 centimeters long, roughly 10 inches, delicate and soft to the touch. The snailfish's body is mostly water, which is incompressible and helps it withstand the pressure. Its skeleton is only partially ossified. This soft, pliable skeleton allows the fish's body to adjust to the immense pressure without being crushed. The skin is transparent and lacks pigmentation. Instead of hard, calcified bones, much of its skeletal structure is made of flexible cartilage. Its skull is incomplete, with large gaps where bones should be. Pigments cost energy to produce, and in a food-scarce environment, every bit of energy matters. So the snailfish has evolved to be nearly see-through, its internal organs visible through its translucent skin. Its eyes are tiny and likely non-functional. In the absolute darkness of the Hadal zone, there's no evolutionary advantage to having color. Vision is useless in total darkness, and the genetic analysis of Hadal snailfish has shown that they've lost many of the genes associated with sight. They navigate their world through other senses, using taste receptors on their skin and specialized cells that detect vibrations and chemicals in the water. Their sense of smell is enhanced, allowing them to locate food in the darkness. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation is at the molecular level. All organisms use proteins to carry out the chemical reactions necessary for life. Proteins are long chains of amino acids that fold into specific three-dimensional shapes, and those shapes determine how the proteins function. But pressure disrupts protein folding. Squeeze hard enough, and proteins unfold, becoming useless. For most organisms, the pressure at Hadal depths would cause their proteins to denature, their cellular machinery to break down, their metabolism to fail. Hadal snailfish have evolved multiple solutions to this problem. First, they produce large amounts of a molecule called trimethylamine N oxide, or TMAO. This organic compound acts as a pressure counteractant, stabilizing proteins and preventing them from unfolding even under extreme pressure. But TMAO alone isn't enough. TMAO is found in many deep-sea organisms, and its concentration increases with depth. The deeper you go, the more TMAO you find in the tissues of the creatures living there. At Hadal depths, you'd need so much TMAO that it would become toxic, disrupting other cellular processes. So the snailfish have additional adaptations. They've also developed multiple copies of certain genes. Their cell membranes contain unusually high levels of unsaturated fatty acids, which remain fluid even under crushing pressure, allowing the membranes to continue functioning. They've evolved specialized versions of key proteins that are inherently more resistant to pressure. Under high pressure, oxygen can become toxic, causing cellular damage. The extra ferritin helps the snailfish neutralize these harmful molecules. For example, Hadal snailfish have up to 14 copies of a gene that produces ferritin, a protein that helps protect cells from damage caused by reactive oxygen species. Similarly, they have multiple copies of genes involved in DNA repair. The current depth record for a snailfish is 8,336 meters, set in the Izu-Ogasawara Trench in the Western Pacific. The pressure and other stresses of the Hadal environment can damage DNA, and the snailfish need robust mechanisms to fix that damage and keep their cells functioning. All of these adaptations working together allow the Hadal snailfish to survive at depths that would kill almost any other vertebrate. That's 27,349 feet, more than 5 miles straight down. Beyond this depth, scientists believe there may be a hard limit for fish. Computer models suggest that around 8,200 to 8,500 meters, the amount of TMAO required to stabilize proteins would become so high that it would itself become destabilizing. Below this depth, the basic biochemistry of vertebrate life may simply not be possible. If this is true, then Hadal snailfish are living right at the edge of what's physically possible for a fish. They've pushed the limits of vertebrate adaptation about as far as those limits can be pushed, and yet they seem to be thriving. They occupy a unique ecological niche, feeding primarily on small crustaceans, especially amphipods, which are abundant in the trenches. Snailfish are the most common and abundant fish in Hadal trenches, found at depths where other fish cannot survive. They are, in effect, the apex predators of the Hadal ecosystem, at least among vertebrates, but their lives are short. Studies of the ear bones of Hadal snailfish, structures called otoliths that grow in layers like tree rings, suggest that these fish live only a few years, much shorter lifespans than their shallow water relatives. The snailfish's large pharyngeal jaws, located in their throats, allow them to crush the hard exoskeletons of these prey. The Hadal environment is seismically active. Turbidity currents, underwater avalanches of sediment, sweep down the trench walls. the environment is constantly being disturbed. Trenches are earthquake zones. For a small fish living at the very limits of what's possible, a short, fast life may be the best strategy. Reproduce quickly before the environment kills you. The Hadal snailfish also has large eggs, unusually large for a fish of its size. Females have been found carrying up to 23 mature eggs, each nearly a centimeter in diameter. These large eggs likely give the young a better chance of survival in the harsh Hadal environment. And there's evidence that the larvae spend time in shallower water, perhaps drifting up to depths of less than 1,000 meters, where food is more abundant, before eventually descending to the trenches as they mature. It has evolved over millions of years into a creature so specialized, so finely tuned to its environment, that it can live nowhere else. In this way, the Hadal snailfish has mastered one of the most extreme environments on Earth. It would simply die, its cellular machinery unable to function without the pressure it evolved to tolerate, its proteins unfolding, its membranes failing. Remove the pressure, bring a Hadal snailfish to the surface, and it would not explode as some imagine. The Hadal snailfish is a creature of the deep, and the deep is where it belongs. As you rest tonight, imagine one of these fish, small and translucent, drifting through the absolute darkness 7 miles below the surface. It has no eyes to see with, no light to see by, but it moves with purpose through its world, moving slowly, conserving energy, searching for the faint chemical traces of food. The only home it could ever survive in. The only home it could ever survive in. A perfect adaptation to an imperfect world. A world of pressure and darkness that would kill you or me instantly. But to this fish, it is simply home. The only home it has ever known. Much different. When they retrieved the trap hours later, they found it full of amphipods, small crustaceans that are common throughout the deep ocean. But one specimen in the trap was different. In the year 2012, a team of scientists exploring the Kermadec Trench, north of New Zealand, deployed a baited trap to the seafloor at a depth of 7,000 meters, 23,000 feet. This was a supergiant, not because it was a new species, though that was unusual enough, but because of its size. It was nearly 28 centimeters long, 11 inches, with a pale, almost white body and long, delicate legs. It was an amphipod unlike any they'd seen before. Later, on video footage from the lander, they spotted an even larger individual, estimated at 34 centimeters, 13 inches, slowly approaching the bait with an almost clumsy swimming motion. It was like finding a foot-long cockroach, the largest amphipod ever captured at Hadal depths. This was Elicella gigantea, the supergiant amphipod, and its discovery at Hadal depths in the Kermadec Trench was the first time anyone had seen or captured one in over 30 years. These small, shrimp-like crustaceans are among the most successful animals on the planet, with thousands of species occupying every aquatic environment from freshwater streams to polar seas to the deepest trenches. Amphipods are everywhere in the ocean. In the deep ocean, amphipods are especially abundant. They're scavengers, arriving in swarms whenever food falls to the seafloor. Drop bait at abyssal depths, and within hours, hundreds or even thousands of amphipods will have found it, covering the bait in a writhing mass of feeding bodies. Most amphipods are tiny, just a centimeter or two long. They scuttle along the seafloor, burrow in sediment, or swim in the water column, feeding on detritus, bacteria, or smaller organisms. As depth increases, other scavengers, fish like rattails and cutthroat eels, disappear. They can't tolerate the pressure. They can smell carrion from great distances, following chemical gradients through the water, converging on any source of nutrition, and in the Hadal zone, amphipods become even more dominant. But amphipods continue, thriving in the trenches, sometimes in astonishing numbers. Baited cameras deployed at depths exceeding 8,000 meters have filmed clouds of amphipods so dense they obscure the bait entirely, thousands of individuals swarming, pushing, feeding. But Elicella gigantea is different. These deep amphipods are typically small, 2 to 3 centimeters on average. They're fast-moving, darting through the water, constantly searching for food. When video footage captured one approaching bait, it didn't swarm like the smaller amphipods. It stumbled into the bait, latched on, and gorged itself for hours, eating until it was full. It's a supergiant, 10 to 15 times larger than its smaller relatives, and it moves slowly, clumsily, drifting through the water rather than darting. This is abyssal gigantism, a phenomenon seen in several deep-sea species. Certain organisms in the deep ocean grow much larger than their shallow water relatives: giant isopods, giant squid, giant sea spiders, and giant amphipods. The cold temperatures of the deep sea slow metabolism, allowing organisms to live longer and grow larger. The high pressure may favor larger body size by increasing cell size and lifespan. The reasons for this gigantism are still debated, but several factors may contribute, and the scarcity of food may select for larger individuals who can survive longer periods without eating, gorging when food is available, and then fasting for weeks or months. It's a slow, patient scavenger, too large to be easily preyed upon by snailfish or other Hadal predators, able to consume massive amounts of food when it finds a carcass, then drifting through the darkness, conserving energy, waiting for the next meal. Alicella gigantea seems built for this feast or famine lifestyle. No one saw them. In the 1980s, a few more were found near Hawaii. Then, for decades, nothing. For years, supergiant amphipods were considered rare. They were first discovered in the 1890s, when a few specimens were dredged from the deep Atlantic near the Canary Islands. No one caught them. But as deep-sea exploration has increased, especially in the Hadal trenches, supergiant amphipods keep showing up. They seem to be one of the ocean's rarest creatures, an enigma that appeared briefly and then vanished. They've been found in the Kermadec Trench, the Mariana Trench, the Japan Trench, the Peru-Chile Trench, and others. They've been filmed in the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. They're not rare at all. In 2025, a comprehensive genetic study analyzed samples from around the world and concluded that Alicella gigantea may inhabit up to 59% of the world's oceans, living in the deep abyssal and upper Hadal zones across vast areas. They're cosmopolitan, distributed globally, living in trenches and deep basins all over the planet. We simply didn't know they were there because we weren't looking. While snailfish are the top vertebrate predators, feeding on smaller amphipods, the supergiants occupy a different niche, one that in shallower waters might be filled by crabs or lobsters. The supergiant amphipod is likely the largest invertebrate predator in many Hadal ecosystems. This suggests that supergiant amphipods either disperse across vast distances, somehow moving from one trench to another across the deep abyssal plains, or that they separated from a common ancestor very recently in evolutionary terms, and haven't had time to diverge significantly. They're slow-moving scavengers, arriving late to carcasses but staying long, eating until nothing remains. Genetic studies have also revealed something surprising about supergiant amphipods. Despite being found all over the world, in trenches separated by thousands of miles, they show remarkably little genetic diversity. Different populations are nearly identical at the genetic level. Smaller amphipods in the Hadal zone have their own adaptations. Some species have been found to possess cellulase enzymes, allowing them to digest wood. The stable, cold environment of the deep sea may also slow evolutionary change, keeping populations similar even when they're geographically isolated. When trees fall into rivers and are carried out to sea, some of that wood eventually sinks to the ocean floor. In the Hadal trenches, where food is scarce, wood becomes a valuable resource. Other Hadal amphipods have extreme concentrations of pressure-stabilizing compounds in their tissues, even higher than what's found in snailfish. Some have specialized enzymes that function only under high pressure, becoming inactive if the pressure drops. These are creatures that cannot survive anywhere else. Amphipods that can break down cellulose have access to a food source that few other organisms can utilize. They've traded adaptability for specialization, becoming so finely tuned to the Hadal environment that they're trapped there, unable to migrate to shallower depths bound to the trenches. And yet, these creatures are already being affected by human activity. Studies have found high concentrations of microplastics and persistent organic pollutants in the tissues of Hadal amphipods. This is shocking. Chemicals like PCBs, which were banned decades ago but still persist in the environment, have been detected at levels comparable to those found in some of the most polluted surface waters. The Hadal zone is the most remote, inaccessible place on Earth, and yet it is contaminated. And eventually, it reaches the trenches, where scavenging amphipods ingest it along with their food. The implications are troubling. Currents concentrated. Particles of plastic, fibers from synthetic clothing, fragments of bottles and bags, all of it sinks, slowly but inexorably, through the water column. Marine snow carries it down. The supergiant pale and slow, drifting through the dark. The smaller amphipods, swarming in clouds, searching tirelessly for food. If Hadal amphipods are already contaminated, then the entire Hadal ecosystem may be at risk. As you drift towards sleep, picture these strange creatures. We don't yet know how these pollutants affect Hadal organisms, but studies in shallower waters have shown that microplastics can cause inflammation, disrupt reproduction, and accumulate toxins. Without them, the Hadal zone would be even more barren, even more desolate. They are small, simple creatures, but they've mastered an environment that would destroy most other life. These are the janitors of the deep, the recyclers, breaking down whatever falls from above and returning nutrients to the ecosystem. And they continue, even now, in the absolute darkness, in the crushing pressure, surviving, feeding, reproducing, living lives we can barely comprehend. But they are there, 7 miles down, in the cold, in the trenches, where the ocean finally ends. When scientists first began exploring the Hadal zone, they expected to find a barren wasteland. In the dark, the Hadal zone is home to a surprising diversity of life, from microscopic bacteria to giant single-celled organisms, from delicate sea cucumbers to bizarre stalk creatures that look like something from another planet. A place so extreme, so hostile, that only the simplest forms of life, bacteria, and perhaps a few hardy microorganisms could survive. They were wrong. All of them adapted to conditions that would be instantly lethal to most other organisms. All of them thriving in a place we once thought uninhabitable. In some trenches, sea cucumbers are the most abundant visible organism, covering the seafloor in a slow-moving carpet of soft, sausage-shaped bodies. These creatures crawl slowly across the seafloor, using tube feet on their underside, filtering sediment through their mouths and extracting whatever nutrients they can find. Among the most common inhabitants of the Hadal zone are sea cucumbers, soft-bodied echinoderms related to sea stars and sea urchins. Some Hadal sea cucumbers are thought to have originated in the frigid waters around Antarctica. Ocean currents flowing from the poles down into the deep sea may have carried their larvae to the trenches, where the cold temperatures, low food availability, and high pressure created an environment not unlike Antarctic waters. These sea cucumbers adapted, and now they thrive in the Hadal zone, crawling through the soft sediment, ingesting organic particles, surviving on the thinnest margins. They look like pale, irregular blobs, sometimes with intricate branching structures. Even more bizarre are the xenophyophores, giant single-celled organisms that live on the seafloor. These are among the largest single cells known to science, some reaching diameters of over 10 centimeters, 4 inches. How such a large, complex structure can exist as a single cell is still not fully understood, but xenophyophores are abundant in the deep sea, and some species have been found in the Hadal trenches. Xenophyophores are foraminifera, a group of protists that build shells, or tests, out of sediment particles glued together with organic cement. Inside the shell is a single vast cell, filled with hundreds or thousands of nuclei. There are sea anemones, delicate, flower-like creatures that attach to rocks and extend their tentacles into the current, waiting to capture passing prey. There are also polychaete worms, bristle worms that burrow through the sediment, and bivalves, clams and mussels that filter feed on the sparse organic matter suspended in the water. They feed on bacteria and organic particles in the sediment, and they may play an important role in the ecosystem by mixing and aerating the seafloor. In the upper Hadal zone, between 6,000 and 8,000 meters, there's a surprising amount of diversity, but as depth increases, diversity decreases. There are isopods, crustaceans related to pillbugs, scuttling across the bottom. Below 8,000 meters, the environment becomes too extreme for most organisms. The pressure is simply too great. By the time you reach Challenger Deep, at nearly 11,000 meters, the community is sparse. Sea cucumbers, the biochemical solutions that allow life to exist at 7,000 meters, start to break down at 9,000 or 10,000. Fewer and fewer species can adapt, amphipods, and that's about it. A few other invertebrates. Bacteria. The deepest parts of the ocean are inhabited only by invertebrates and microorganisms. But even at these extreme depths, life persists. The snailfish, the deepest living vertebrate, can't make it past about 8,300 meters. Below that depth, there are no fish. Bacteria in the sediment break down organic matter, releasing nutrients back into the ecosystem. This is partly because trenches act as funnels, concentrating organic matter. Sediment sliding down the steep walls of the trench carries food with it, depositing it on the trench floor. Microbial communities in the Hadal zone are incredibly active, with rates of carbon turnover that rival those in much shallower, more productive waters. Earthquake-triggered avalanches, turbidity currents, can deliver massive amounts of sediment and organic matter to the deepest parts of the trench in a matter of hours. So while the Hadal zone is far from the surface, far from the sunlit waters where photosynthesis occurs, it's not as nutrient-poor as the surrounding abyssal plains. Over time, over millions of years, the trenches have become depot centers, places where sediment and organic matter collect, creating pockets of relative abundance in the deep. Food is scarce, yes, but it accumulates. One of the most important sources of nutrition in the deep ocean is whale falls. When a whale dies and its carcass sinks to the seafloor, it becomes a bonanza. Hundreds of tons of flesh and fat and bone, all of it rich in organic matter, all of it available to scavengers. And where there's food, there's life. Whale falls create oases in the deep, supporting entire communities of organisms that specialize in feeding on decomposing whale tissue. Then other scavengers, crabs and hagfish, and sleeper sharks. Over months or years, the soft tissue is consumed. Scavenging amphipods arrive first, swarming over the carcass in massive numbers, stripping away the flesh. Snailfish follow. Specialized worms, Osedax worms, bore into the bone, digesting it with the help of symbiotic bacteria. A whale fall can support a community for decades, slowly being consumed by the deep. If a whale carcass sinks into a Hadal trench, it becomes one of the most valuable resources in the environment, a massive input of food that can sustain the local community for a very long time. What remains, the skeleton, continues to support life. Bacteria colonize the bones, breaking down the lipids stored in the bone marrow. Wood in the deep sea is remarkably long-lasting, resisting decay for years or even decades, and it provides a substrate for organisms that can digest it. Wood falls are similar. When trees fall into the ocean and sink, they carry with them not just cellulose but also resins and other organic compounds. Some amphipods, as mentioned before, have cellulase enzymes that allow them to break down wood fibers. These wood-boring amphipods are unique to the Hadal zone, exploiting a resource that few other organisms can use. There are also chemosynthetic bacteria in the Hadal zone, organisms that derive energy not from sunlight but from chemical reactions. These bacteria oxidize the chemicals, using the energy released to build organic molecules from carbon dioxide, essentially performing photosynthesis without light. In some trenches, fluids rich in methane and hydrogen sulfide seep up from the subducting plate below. These fluids are toxic to most organisms, but to chemosynthetic bacteria, they're fuel. Around these seeps, communities of organisms can develop that are completely independent of the surface ecosystem, sustained entirely by chemical energy from the Earth's interior. Life in the Hadal zone, then, is not uniform. Each trench is a separate experiment in evolution, a separate testing ground for the limits of life. It varies from trench to trench, depending on the local geology, the amount of organic matter that accumulates, the presence or absence of chemical seeps. And in each one, we find organisms that have solved the problems of existence in their own unique ways. As you rest tonight, imagine these creatures: the sea cucumber, slowly crawling, mouth open, ingesting sediment grain by grain, extracting what little nutrition it can. The xenophyophore, a single cell the size of your fist, pulsing gently on the seafloor, surrounded by its glittering shell of sediment. They are all down there, right now, living their lives in the darkness, unaware of the surface world, unaware of the sunlight and the storms and the life that thrives in the upper ocean. To them, the Hadal zone is not a hostile place. The bacteria in the mud, invisible but vital, breaking down organic matter, recycling nutrients, keeping the ecosystem functioning. And the cold, the scarcity, the isolation, these are not obstacles, but simply the conditions of existence. Life, as always, finds a way. It's simply home. The pressure that would crush us is normal to them. The darkness that would blind us is all they've ever known. And in the Hadal depths, where the ocean finally ends, life has found many ways. The most important question for any organism is not how extreme its environment is, but how well adapted it is to that environment. And the creatures of the Hadal zone are exquisitely adapted. Pressure is the defining characteristic of the Hadal zone. At sea level, the atmosphere exerts a pressure of roughly 14.7 pounds per square inch. But descend into the ocean, and pressure increases rapidly. We don't notice it because our bodies are built to withstand it. Our tissues and fluids are incompressible, and the air spaces in our lungs and ears equalize with the surrounding pressure. Water is much denser than air. By the time you reach 1,000 meters, the pressure is 100 atmospheres. Every 10 meters of depth adds 1 atmosphere of pressure. At 10,000 meters, it's 1,000 atmospheres. At the bottom of Challenger Deep, the pressure is roughly 1,100 atmospheres, or about 16,000 pounds per square inch. If you could somehow transport a human to that depth without protection, the results would be catastrophic. The air spaces in your lungs would be compressed to nothing. Your eardrums would rupture. The gases dissolved in your blood would come out of solution, but the most fundamental damage would be at the cellular level. Pressure affects the structure of proteins, the molecular machines that keep cells functioning. Squeeze a protein hard enough, and it changes shape. The active site where chemical reactions occur becomes distorted. Enzymes stop working. Cellular metabolism shuts down. Membranes lose their fluidity, becoming stiff and impermeable. Organisms that are not adapted to pressure simply cannot function at Hadal depths. Their biochemistry fails. Their cells die. But Hadal organisms have evolved a suite of adaptations that allow them to not just survive but thrive under these conditions. As mentioned earlier, one of the most important adaptations is the accumulation of pressure-stabilizing compounds like TMAO. Trimethylamine N-oxide is a small organic molecule that interacts with proteins, helping them maintain their proper shape even under high pressure. TMAO is a common osmolyte in marine organisms, used to balance the salt concentration in cells, but in deep-sea organisms, it takes on an additional role. The deeper you go, the more TMAO you find. Shallow water fish have low concentrations. Fish at 1,000 meters have moderate concentrations. Fish at 4,000 meters have high concentrations. And Hadal snailfish, living at 8,000 meters, have some of the highest concentrations of TMAO ever measured. This is not a coincidence. TMAO works. It stabilizes proteins under pressure, but there's a limit. At high enough concentrations, TMAO itself becomes destabilizing, disrupting cellular processes. This is thought to be why there's a depth limit for fish, somewhere around 8,200 to 8,500 meters. Beyond that depth, you'd need so much TMAO that it would do more harm than good. Fish can't go deeper because the solution to the pressure problem becomes the problem. But invertebrates, creatures without backbones, seem to have different biochemical solutions. Amphipods live deeper than fish. Sea cucumbers live deeper than fish. They must be using different strategies. Some Hadal invertebrates have been found to use other pressure-stabilizing compounds, like pseudoinositol and homarine, in addition to TMAO. These molecules work together, each stabilizing a different aspect of cellular function, allowing the organism to tolerate even higher pressures. Other adaptations are more structural. Hadal organisms tend to have incomplete skeletons, made of cartilage rather than hard bone. Calcium, which is used to build bones and shells in most organisms, is harder to incorporate into tissues under high pressure. Bones become brittle, shells become fragile. So many Hadal organisms have reduced or entirely lost their hard structures. The Hadal snailfish has a skull with large gaps, bones that are soft and flexible. Sea cucumbers have no skeleton at all, just a body wall made of connective tissue. This allows them to compress slightly under pressure without breaking. Cell membranes are another critical adaptation point. Membranes are made of lipids, fats that form a double layer around each cell, controlling what goes in and out. Under high pressure, lipid bilayers become stiffer, less fluid, less able to function. Proteins embedded in the membrane can't move. Channels that allow ions to pass through become blocked. To counteract this, Hadal organisms have evolved membranes with unusually high levels of unsaturated fatty acids. These are lipids with kinks in their molecular structure, which prevents them from packing together tightly. The result is a membrane that remains fluid even under high pressure, allowing the cell to continue functioning. Enzymes, the proteins that catalyze chemical reactions in cells, are another focus of adaptation. Many enzymes in Hadal organisms are intrinsically pressure tolerant. They've evolved slightly different structures, different amino acid sequences, that allow them to maintain their shape and function under pressure. Some enzymes actually work better under pressure, becoming more active as depth increases. These are called piezophilic enzymes, pressure-loving enzymes, and they're a key part of how Hadal bacteria and other microorganisms thrive in the trenches. DNA itself can be damaged by pressure. High hydrostatic pressure can cause breaks in DNA strands, disrupt replication, and induce mutations. Hadal organisms have enhanced DNA repair mechanisms, multiple copies of genes involved in fixing damaged DNA, ensuring that even if mutations occur, they can be repaired before they cause problems. All of these adaptations, working together, allow Hadal organisms to live where almost nothing else can, but adaptation comes at a cost. Most Hadal organisms are specialists. They've become so well adapted to high pressure that they can't survive without it. Bring a Hadal snailfish to the surface, and it dies, not from decompression in the way a human diver might suffer from the bends, but because its cellular machinery, tuned to function at 1,000 atmospheres, fails when the pressure drops. Its proteins unfold, its membranes become too fluid, it cannot regulate its internal environment. Hadal organisms are trapped in their world, unable to leave, unable to colonize shallower depths. This is why each trench is isolated. The amphipods in the Mariana Trench are different from those in the Kermadec Trench, which are different from those in the Japan Trench. They evolved separately, in isolation, each lineage adapting to its local environment, and now they're stuck there, separated by thousands of miles of shallower water they cannot cross. And yet within those trenches, they thrive. The adaptations that trap them also free them, allowing them to exploit an environment with few competitors, few predators, a refuge at the very bottom of the world. As you drift now deeper into sleep, imagine what it would be like to be adapted to pressure, to feel the weight of the ocean not as a burden but as a necessity, to live in a body so finely tuned to the deep that the surface world would be as alien and lethal to you as the deep is to us. Imagine that you belong there, that the darkness and the cold and the pressure are not things to escape but things that define you, that make your existence possible. This is the world of the Hadal organism, a world where the impossible is simply normal, where life has found solutions to problems we didn't think had solutions, where the edge of survival is not a line to avoid, but a place to call home. One of the greatest challenges for life in the Hadal zone is food. The surface ocean is productive, full of photosynthesizing phytoplankton that form the base of the food web, supporting fish and whales and seabirds. But the Hadal zone is 7 miles away from that productivity, separated by an immense column of water, where most organic matter is consumed before it ever reaches the bottom. In the open ocean above the abyssal plains, only about 1% of the organic matter produced at the surface makes it to the seafloor at 4,000 meters. By the time you reach 7 or 8,000 meters, that percentage is even smaller, and yet the Hadal zone is not entirely barren. Food does reach the trenches, and when it does, it can accumulate in surprising amounts. The primary source of nutrition is marine snow, the constant, gentle rain of organic particles drifting down from the surface. Dead plankton, fecal pellets from zooplankton, bits of gelatinous organisms, fragments of larger animals. All of this sinks, slowly but inexorably, falling through the water column at rates of tens or hundreds of meters per day. Most of it is consumed by organisms in the shallower layers. Bacteria break it down. Zooplankton eat it. Fish feed on the zooplankton. But a small fraction escapes. And that fraction, tiny as it is, accumulates over time. The trenches, with their steep walls and narrow floors, act as funnels. Particles drifting down from the surface don't fall evenly across the seafloor. Ocean currents push them sideways, concentrating them in certain areas. When particles reach the trench walls, they slide downslope, carried by gravity and occasional turbidity currents, avalanches of sediment triggered by earthquakes or other disturbances. All of that material ends up on the trench floor, creating localized areas of higher organic content. This is why the Hadal zone, despite being the deepest part of the ocean, can sometimes have higher levels of biological activity than the surrounding abyssal plains. The trenches concentrate food. They become depot centers, places where sediment and organic matter accumulate over long periods. Studies have measured the rate of oxygen consumption in Hadal sediments, an indicator of how much microbial activity is occurring, and found that it's surprisingly high, comparable to rates in much shallower waters. The microbes in the sediment are busy. breaking down organic matter, respiring, consuming oxygen, producing carbon dioxide. This suggests that there's more food available in the trenches than we might expect. But food delivery to the Hadal zone is highly variable. The amount of organic matter that reaches the trench floor depends on surface productivity, which varies with seasons and ocean currents. It depends on the depth and steepness of the trench. It depends on seismic activity, which can trigger sudden, massive deliveries of sediment. This creates a boom and bust cycle. For long periods, food is scarce. The community survives on the thin trickle of marine snow and the slow accumulation of organic matter in the sediment. But occasionally, a large input occurs. A whale carcass sinks into the trench, or a turbidity current delivers tons of fresh sediment, or a piece of wood from a distant forest arrives, carried by ocean currents. When these events happen, the Hadal community responds. Scavenging amphipods arrive in massive numbers, sometimes hundreds or thousands at a single carcass. They feed voraciously, consuming as much as they can as quickly as they can, because they don't know when the next meal will arrive. Snailfish follow, feeding on the amphipods and picking at the carcass. Sea cucumbers move toward the disturbance, drawn by chemical signals in the water. This feast-and-fast lifestyle has shaped the evolution of Hadal organisms. Many are highly mobile, able to move quickly to a food source when it appears. Amphipods have acute chemoreceptors, capable of detecting the faintest traces of decomposing tissue in the water. They can locate a carcass from miles away, swimming or drifting with the current toward the source. Others are adapted to long periods of starvation. Some Hadal amphipods can survive for months without food, living off stored lipids in their tissues. Their metabolism slows. They enter a kind of dormancy, drifting through the water, conserving energy, waiting. When food finally arrives, they gorge themselves, storing as much energy as possible before the feast ends. This strategy is common in food-limited environments. It's why many deep-sea organisms are larger than their shallow water relatives. A larger body can store more energy, allowing the organism to survive longer between meals. Another critical source of food in the Hadal zone is chemosynthesis. In some trenches, especially those associated with subduction zones, fluids rich in methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other reduced chemicals seep up from the subducting plate below. These fluids are the result of chemical reactions occurring deep in the Earth's crust, where water, heated and pressurized, reacts with minerals in the rock. When these fluids reach the seafloor, they encounter bacteria capable of oxidizing the chemicals, using the energy released to build organic molecules. These chemosynthetic bacteria form the base of a food web that's completely independent of sunlight. They're eaten by larger organisms, which are in turn eaten by predators, creating a community sustained entirely by chemical energy from the planet's interior. Chemosynthetic communities are well known from hydrothermal vents, those hot springs on the seafloor where superheated water gushes from cracks in the crust. But they also occur in Hadal trenches, though the conditions are different. The fluids are not as hot, the flow rates are lower, but the chemistry is similar, and the result is the same. Life sustained by the Earth's internal processes, rather than by the sun. We don't yet know how common chemosynthetic communities are in the Hadal zone. Most trenches have not been thoroughly explored, but where they do occur, they may provide a critical, reliable source of food in an otherwise food-poor environment. Bacteria growing on chemical seeps can be grazed by amphipods, sea cucumbers, and other organisms, supplementing the sparse rain of organic matter from the surface. There's also evidence that Hadal trenches may host subsurface microbial ecosystems, bacteria living not on the seafloor, but within the rocks of the subducting plate itself. As the plate descends into the Earth, it carries with it seawater trapped in cracks and pores. This water heats up and reacts with the rock, creating conditions where chemosynthetic bacteria might thrive. If this is true, then the Hadal trenches are not just surface environments but gateways to a deep biosphere, a hidden world of microbial life within the Earth's crust. The boundaries between the ocean and the solid Earth, between life and geology, become blurred. As you rest, imagine the Hadal seafloor, mostly barren, covered in fine sediment. But here and there, a sea cucumber crawls slowly, sifting through the mud for organic particles. An amphipod swims past, antenna twitching, searching for the faint chemical trace of food. And somewhere, perhaps miles away, a carcass is falling through the water, sinking slowly, a bonanza waiting to happen. This is a world of scarcity and patience, a world where every calorie matters, where organisms have learned to survive on almost nothing, to wait for months or years between meals, to respond instantly when an opportunity arises. It's a harsh world, but it's not a hopeless one. Life has adapted, and in the Hadal depths, where food is scarce but not entirely absent, life persists, quietly, patiently, waiting in the dark. The Hadal zone is often described as pristine, untouched, one of the last truly wild places on Earth. But that description, comforting as it might be, is no longer accurate. The deepest parts of the ocean are not beyond the reach of human activity. In fact, they are already contaminated, already affected by pollutants that we released decades ago. Chemicals that have traveled through the atmosphere, through rivers, through ocean currents, and finally settled in the sediments of the Hadal trenches. Plastic is everywhere. Microplastics, tiny fragments of synthetic polymers, have been found in every ocean, from the surface to the deepest depths. They're in the Arctic ice and the Antarctic waters. They're in the food chains of coastal ecosystems and the open ocean. And they're in the Hadal zone. Studies have found microplastic particles in sediment cores collected from the Mariana Trench, at depths exceeding 10,000 meters. Fibers from synthetic clothing, fragments of plastic bags, particles from larger items that have broken down over time. All of it sinking, slowly but inexorably, through the water column, accumulating on the seafloor. Hadal amphipods collected from multiple trenches have been found to contain microplastics in their digestive systems. These amphipods are scavengers, feeding on whatever organic matter they can find, and they're ingesting plastic along with their food. Whether this causes harm is still unclear, but studies in shallower waters have shown that microplastics can cause inflammation, reduce feeding rates, disrupt reproduction, and accumulate toxins. If Hadal amphipods are suffering similar effects, the entire Hadal ecosystem could be at risk. The amphipods are a critical link in the food web, breaking down organic matter and serving as prey for snailfish and other predators. If their populations decline, the whole ecosystem could collapse. Even more concerning are persistent organic pollutants, chemicals like PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which were used for decades in electrical equipment, plastics, and other industrial applications. PCBs are toxic, causing cancer and disrupting hormones in many organisms. They were banned in most countries by the 1980s, but they don't break down easily. They persist in the environment for decades, accumulating in sediments and in the fatty tissues of organisms. PCBs have been found in Hadal amphipods at concentrations comparable to those in highly polluted coastal areas. This is shocking. The Mariana Trench is thousands of miles from any major source of PCBs, and yet the amphipods there are as contaminated as those living near industrial pollution. How did the PCBs get there? Likely through a combination of atmospheric transport and ocean currents. PCBs are semi-volatile. They evaporate from contaminated sites, travel through the atmosphere, and eventually settle back to the surface, often in rain. From there they enter rivers and coastal waters, where they're taken up by plankton and other small organisms. When those organisms die, they sink, carrying the PCBs with them. Over time, over decades, the PCBs accumulate in the deep ocean and in the Hadal trenches, where organic matter concentrates, so do the pollutants. This is bioaccumulation. Pollutants that were released at the surface 50 years ago are still circulating through the environment, still being taken up by organisms, still causing harm. And in the Hadal zone, at the very bottom of the ocean, they've reached concentrations that we never expected. The implications are troubling. If even the deepest, most remote parts of the ocean are contaminated, then there's truly nowhere on Earth that's untouched by human activity. We have altered every ecosystem on the planet, from the highest mountains to the deepest trenches. The Hadal zone is not a refuge. It's not pristine. It's part of the same interconnected system as every other part of the ocean, and it's being affected by our actions. Climate change is another concern. The deep ocean is not warming as rapidly as the surface, but it is warming. Ocean temperatures at depth have increased measurably over the past few decades, and even small temperature changes can affect deep-sea organisms, which are adapted to very narrow temperature ranges. Warmer water also holds less oxygen, and the deep ocean is already low in oxygen compared to surface waters. If oxygen levels continue to decline, Hadal organisms, which rely on the oxygen dissolved in the water for respiration, could suffer. Changes in ocean circulation could also affect the Hadal zone. The deep ocean is ventilated by currents that carry oxygen-rich water from the polar regions down into the abyss. If those currents weaken or change course, as some climate models predict, the deep ocean could become more stagnant, with lower oxygen levels and less mixing. This could affect food delivery to the Hadal trenches, reducing the already scarce supply of organic matter. Mining is an emerging threat. The deep ocean contains vast deposits of valuable minerals, including polymetallic nodules, manganese nodules that lie on the abyssal plains, and rare earth elements found in seafloor sediments. Mining companies are beginning to explore the possibility of extracting these resources, and while the Hadal trenches themselves are too deep and narrow to be practical mining sites, the surrounding abyssal plains are not. Deep-sea mining operations could disturb vast areas of seafloor, stirring up sediment clouds that could drift for hundreds of miles, smothering organisms and disrupting ecosystems. Even if the trenches themselves are not directly mined, they could be affected by the indirect impacts of mining nearby. We also don't fully understand the ecological connections between the Hadal zone and the rest of the ocean. Larvae of some Hadal species may spend time in shallower waters before descending to the trenches. If those shallower areas are disturbed, it could affect recruitment to the Hadal populations. And the microbes in Hadal sediments, which are breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients, may play a role in global carbon cycling. We don't yet know how important that role is, but it's possible that changes to the Hadal zone could have broader impacts on the ocean's ability to store carbon and regulate the climate. Conservation of the Hadal zone is challenging. It's difficult to protect a place that almost no one can visit, that very few people even know exists, but efforts are being made. Some trenches, including parts of the Mariana Trench, have been designated as marine protected areas where certain activities are restricted. More research is needed to understand Hadal ecosystems, to identify which species live there, how they interact, what threats they face. We need to establish baselines, measurements of what's normal in the Hadal zone, so that we can detect changes over time, and we need to reduce our pollution. Microplastics, persistent organic pollutants. These are problems we created, and they're problems we can solve. If we reduce our use of plastics, if we clean up contaminated sites, if we prevent new pollutants from entering the environment, we can slow the accumulation of these substances in the deep ocean. It will take decades for the ocean to cleanse itself, but the process can begin. The Hadal zone is a remarkable place, a place of extremes, a place of strange and wonderful creatures, a place that challenges our understanding of what life can tolerate. It deserves our respect. It deserves our protection. And as you rest tonight, drifting now into deeper sleep, remember that even the most remote places on Earth are connected to us, that our actions, our choices, ripple outward, affecting ecosystems we may never see. The creatures of the Hadal zone, living their quiet lives in the darkness, are part of the same world we inhabit, and they are depending on us to be better stewards of the planet we all share. Exploring the Hadal zone is one of the greatest engineering challenges in oceanography. To reach depths of 7 to 11,000 meters, a vehicle must withstand pressures that would crush most materials instantly. The technologies required are at the cutting edge of materials, science, mechanical engineering, and robotics. And even with the best technology available, exploring the Hadal zone is dangerous. Vehicles have been lost. Missions have failed. But slowly over decades, we've developed the tools needed to visit the deepest parts of the ocean. The first successful Hadal exploration vehicle was the Trast, the bathyscaphe that carried Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh to Challenger Deep in 1960. The Trieste was essentially an underwater balloon, a large sausage-shaped float filled with gasoline, which is lighter than water and incompressible, providing buoyancy. Attached to the bottom of the float was a small spherical pressure hull made of forged steel, thick enough to withstand the pressure at full ocean depth. Inside this sphere, barely 6 feet in diameter, 2 people could fit, cramped and uncomfortable, but safe. The Trieste descended by releasing gasoline from the float, making it heavier than water. It ascended by dropping iron ballast, making it lighter again. The system was simple, elegant, and effective, but it was also slow, difficult to maneuver, and limited in what it could accomplish. Piccard and Walsh spent 20 minutes at the bottom, peering out through a small window, but they couldn't take samples, couldn't move around, couldn't do much more than observe. After the Trest, manned submersibles capable of reaching Hadal depths were not built for more than 50 years. It wasn't until James Cameron's Deep-Sea Challenger in 2012 that anyone returned. The Deep-Sea Challenger was a radically different design, a vertical torpedo rather than a horizontal balloon. It was built from syntactic foam, a composite material made of tiny glass spheres embedded in epoxy resin. This foam is strong, lightweight, and compressible, able to withstand the pressure at full ocean depth without imploding. The pressure hull, where Cameron sat, was a sphere of specialized steel alloy designed to handle over 16,000 pounds per square inch. The sub was equipped with powerful LED lights, capable of illuminating the seafloor at depths where no sunlight has ever reached, and 3D cameras, allowing Cameron to film in high definition. It had a robotic arm for collecting samples and thrusters for maneuvering. Unlike the Trieste, which could only move up and down, the Deep-Sea Challenger could move laterally, explore and investigate features of interest. Cameron's dive was a success, but the Deep-Sea Challenger never dove to full ocean depth again. After its historic mission, it was donated to a museum. For several years, no one else had a vehicle capable of reaching Challenger deep. That changed in 2019, when Victor Vescovo and his team completed the 5 Deeps expedition, visiting the deepest points in all 5 major ocean basins. Vescovo's submersible, the DSV Limiting Factor, was a 2-person vehicle with a titanium pressure hull, capable of repeated dives to full ocean depth. Unlike the Deep-Sea Challenger, which was designed for a single historic mission, the Limiting Factor was built for extensive exploration. Vescovo has since used the sub to make more than 15 dives to Challenger deep, more than anyone in history. But manned submersibles are expensive, complex, and risky. Most Hadal exploration is now done using unmanned vehicles, remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, and autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs. ROVs are tethered to a surface ship by a cable, which provides power and allows operators to control the vehicle in real time. Cameras on the ROV send live video back to the ship, and robotic arms can manipulate instruments and collect samples. The advantage of ROVs is that they can stay down for long periods, many hours or even days, and they can be controlled precisely. The disadvantage is the tether, which limits how far the ROV can travel and can become entangled. In the deep ocean, where currents are weak and visibility is zero, managing a tether thousands of meters long is a significant challenge. One of the most successful Hadal ROVs was HR Rove Nereus, built by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Nereus was a hybrid, capable of operating as an ROV when tethered or as an AUV when untethered. It reached Challenger deep in 2009, the first unmanned vehicle to do so, and completed numerous missions in Hadal trenches around the Pacific. But in 2014, while exploring the Kermadec Trench at a depth of nearly 10,000 meters, Nereus imploded. The pressure hull failed, and the vehicle was destroyed instantly. The loss of Nereus was a significant setback for Hadal exploration. Building a vehicle capable of withstanding such pressures is difficult and expensive, and few institutions have the resources to do so. Since Nereus, several other deep-diving ROVs have been developed, but none have yet matched its capabilities. AUVs, which operate without a tether, are increasingly being used for Hadal exploration. These vehicles are programmed with a mission before they're deployed, then released to carry out their tasks autonomously. They navigate using onboard sensors, take measurements, record data, and collect samples, all without real-time human control. Once the mission is complete, they drop weights and return to the surface, where they're recovered. AUVs have the advantage of being untethered, allowing them to travel greater distances and explore areas that would be difficult to reach with an ROV. But they also have limitations. If something goes wrong, there's no way to intervene. The vehicle must be able to handle any problems on its own. And without real-time video, operators can't see what the AUV is seeing. They have to trust the programming and wait until the vehicle returns to review the data. Simpler instruments like baited landers are also widely used. These are free-falling platforms that sink to the seafloor, equipped with cameras, sensors, and bait to attract organisms. After a set period, usually several hours, the lander releases weights and floats back to the surface. Landers can be deployed from any ship, don't require sophisticated control systems, and have been used to take thousands of images and videos of Hadal life. They're a cost-effective way to study the Hadal zone, though they're limited in what they can accomplish. They can't move once they're on the seafloor. They can't respond to interesting features. And they can only collect the organisms that are attracted to the bait. All of these technologies have limitations. Cameras can only see a small area at a time. Samples are limited by the capacity of the vehicle's storage. Missions are short, measured in hours rather than days or weeks. And the cost is enormous. A single Hadal mission can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. Despite these challenges, progress is being made. New materials are being developed that can withstand higher pressures. New sensors are being designed that can operate in the extreme Hadal environment. New vehicles are being built, each one pushing the boundaries of what's possible. One area of active research is in developing swarms of small, inexpensive AUVs that could explore Hadal trenches in large numbers, covering more area and providing more data than a single large vehicle. Another area is in improving sample collection. Current vehicles can only collect a limited number of samples, often disturbing the sediment in the process. Better collection systems, perhaps using gentle suction or robotic fingers, could allow for more precise sampling with less disturbance. There's also interest in developing vehicles that can stay on the seafloor for extended periods, perhaps months or even years, continuously monitoring conditions and observing how the ecosystem changes over time. This would require vehicles capable of surviving in the Hadal environment long-term, with power systems that don't rely on batteries brought from the surface. As technology improves, our understanding of the Hadal zone will improve with it. Each new vehicle, each new instrument, allows us to see a little more, to learn a little more, to piece together a clearer picture of life at the very bottom of the ocean. And as you drift now, deeper into sleep, imagine those vehicles, small, silent, descending through the darkness, lights blazing in the black, cameras recording, sensors measuring. They're down there right now, some of them, exploring on our behalf, venturing into places we cannot go, bringing back images and data and samples that will help us understand one of the last great frontiers on Earth. And someday, perhaps, we'll know the Hadal zone as well as we know the mountains or the forests or the shallow seas. Someday, the deepest parts of the ocean will be as familiar as the surface. But until then, they remain mysterious, waiting in the darkness, holding secrets we've only begun to uncover. We've descended through the ocean, layer by layer, from the sunlit surface to the twilight zone, from the midnight depths to the abyssal plains, and finally down into the Hadal trenches. We've reached the bottom, the very end of the ocean, the deepest points on our planet. It's a place beyond the reach of light, beyond the tolerance of most life, beyond what we once thought possible. And yet, it's not empty. The Hadal zone is home to creatures that have adapted to conditions we can barely comprehend. Snailfish with transparent skin and soft bones, drifting through the darkness, hunting for amphipods. Supergiant amphipods, pale and slow, scavenging on the rare carcasses that sink from above. Sea cucumbers crawling through the sediment, filtering nutrients from the mud. Bacteria in the ooze, breaking down organic matter, recycling nutrients, keeping the ecosystem functioning. These creatures are not struggling to survive. They're thriving. They've found solutions to the problems of existence at the extreme, solutions that work, that have allowed them to colonize the deepest, most hostile environment on Earth. The Hadal zone is, in its way, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of life. It shows us that even in the most unlikely places, even where conditions seem impossible, life can find a way. But it also shows us how much we still don't know. Most of the Hadal trenches have never been thoroughly explored. We don't know what species live in them, how diverse they are, how they interact, how they evolved. We don't know how Hadal ecosystems will respond to the changes we're imposing on the ocean, to warming and acidification and pollution. We don't know if the creatures we've discovered so far are common or rare, if they're resilient or fragile, if they can adapt to new conditions or if they're already at the limits of what they can tolerate. The Hadal zone is a mystery, a vast, dark, pressure-crushed mystery, hidden beneath miles of water, inaccessible to most people, unknown even to most scientists. But it's also part of our world, part of the same ocean that laps at our shores, that regulates our climate, that produces the oxygen we breathe. It's connected to us, even if we never see it, even if we never think about it. And the creatures that live there, strange as they are our fellow inhabitants of this blue planet. They share the same basic biochemistry, the same genetic code, the same evolutionary history. They're part of the tree of life, branches that split off long ago but still connected to the trunk, still connected to us. As you drift now into deeper sleep, imagine that connection. Imagine the ocean as a single vast living system, from the surface to the very bottom, all of it interconnected, all of it part of the same whole. The sunlight that falls on the surface, warming the water, driving photosynthesis, creating the food that eventually, after a long journey, reaches the Hadal trenches. The currents that circulate oxygen and nutrients, linking the poles to the tropics, the surface to the deep. The migrations of organisms, whales diving to feed, fish moving between layers, plankton drifting with the tides, and the long, slow rain of organic matter, falling like snow through the darkness, carrying energy and nutrients down, 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 to the very bottom, where it feeds the creatures we've been visiting tonight. It's all connected, and we're part of it. Even here, even now, as you rest in your bed, warm and safe and far from the ocean, you're part of the same system. The oxygen you breathe was produced by phytoplankton in the ocean. The water cycle that brings rain to your city starts with evaporation from the sea. The fish you eat, the salt in your food, the climate that shapes your weather, all of it is tied to the ocean, and the ocean extends all the way to the Hadal zone, 7 miles down, where snailfish swim in the dark. Tonight you've traveled to the deepest parts of the ocean. You've seen creatures that live under pressures that would crush you instantly, in darkness that's absolute, in cold that's unrelenting. You've learned about adaptations that allow life to persist where it should not be possible. And you've been reminded that even the most remote places on Earth are connected to us, affected by us, part of the same world we inhabit. The Hadal zone is where the ocean finally ends, where the water presses against the Earth's crust, where the seafloor drops no lower, where the pressure cannot increase. It's the bottom, the limit, the edge of the marine world. And yet, it's not an end. It's a beginning. The sediments of the Hadal zone are being subducted, carried down into the Earth's mantle, recycled, eventually to rise again as volcanic rock. The water trapped in those sediments is released, contributing to volcanic eruptions, to the water cycle, to the renewal of the planet's surface. The Hadal zone is where the ocean meets geology, where biology meets planetary processes, where life clings to the very edge of existence. It's a place of endings and beginnings, of extremes and adaptations, of darkness, and in its own strange way, light. Not the light of the sun, but the light of understanding, the illumination that comes from exploring, from questioning, from seeking to know what lies beyond our everyday experience. As you rest now, let yourself drift. Let the images of the Hadal zone fade into the background of your mind. The snailfish swimming slowly in the dark, the amphipods swarming around a fallen carcass, the sea cucumbers crawling through the sediment, the bacteria in the mud, invisible but vital. Let them all fade, gently, as you sink deeper into sleep. You've been to the bottom of the ocean. You've seen where the world ends and begins again. And now, you can rest. Safe, warm, surrounded by air and light, but carrying with you the knowledge of that other world, that dark, cold, pressure-filled world where life persists against all odds, where the ocean finally ends, and where, even now, creatures are living their quiet lives, unaware of you, unaware of the surface, unaware of anything beyond their own existence. They are there, in the Hadal depths, in the trenches, in the darkness, and they will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as the ocean exists, living, surviving, adapting, thriving, down where the ocean finally ends. Good night.